For centuries, it was believed that darkness had settled over Europe, knowledge was stifled, and an invisible power manipulated the truth. But did the Church truly hold back humanity's progress for 1,000 years? Or are there even deeper mysteries still buried in the shadows? Welcome to KTK History, where we guide you on a journey to uncover forgotten twists, untold conspiracies, and the truth behind the question: who really imprisoned the world's knowledge? Get ready, because right now, we're about to open the door to a story no one ever dared to tell. In the final days of the Roman Empire, Europe seemed to hold its breath. Roads once bustling with traders fell silent, aqueducts cracked and crumbled, and once proud marble forums lay in eerie ruin, overtaken by weeds and the whispers of ghosts. The heart of Western civilization had stopped beating. But amidst the collapse, something even more profound was quietly happening: an exodus of knowledge, a vanishing of light that would plunge a continent into centuries of darkness. Where did the knowledge of Greece and Rome go? Who carried away the words of Plato, Aristotle, and Euclid? Who locked away the engineering secrets of Archimedes or the medical insights of Galen? It is easy to imagine barbarians torching libraries in their fury, but the truth is more subtle and far more unsettling. The ideas of the ancients didn't just burn, they were hidden, copied in secret, and stored in places where few could ever see them again. As Rome fell, monks retreated into fortified monasteries scattered among the dense forests and rugged hills of Europe. There, in candlelit scriptoria, they spent long, silent nights painstakingly copying texts by hand. On their pages, lines of Latin danced in dark ink across parchment, preserving a fragile thread to a past that was otherwise slipping away. Yet outside these monastic walls, villages grew more insular, languages fractured into dialects, and the memories of the old world faded like the last glow of a dying fire. Ordinary people, illiterate and fearful of a chaotic world, turned not to reason or philosophy, but to superstition, charms, and the comforting absolutes offered by a rising church. Instead of debates in bustling Roman forums, they gathered around fires whispering of omens and portents. In these years, the common mind stopped seeking how the world worked and instead asked only how to survive it. How did this transformation happen? Who decided that learning should remain behind stone walls? Was it an act of mercy to keep the flame alive until better times, or an act of control to claim sole authority over what people could know? If you look closely, you'll see a riddle at the heart of Europe's darkest centuries. Monasteries, after all, were both sanctuaries and prisons for knowledge. On one hand, they were the last bulwarks against complete oblivion, preserving manuscripts that would have otherwise vanished forever. On the other, they were gatekeepers, controlling what knowledge could leave their thick walls. Books could be copied, but not everyone could read them. Ideas could be discussed, but only among those deemed worthy. It was here that the paradox of medieval learning took root. Knowledge was both protected and imprisoned, kept alive, yet kept hidden. Some historians argue the monks were heroes, guarding civilization against the storms of barbarian invasions. Others see them as conspirators, hoarding ideas to maintain power over a frightened populace desperate for guidance. The truth, perhaps, lies somewhere in between, tangled in the motives of men trying to hold society together while ensuring their own survival. Meanwhile, as Roman infrastructure decayed, Europe fragmented. Trade routes dissolved, cutting off communication between cities. Even where old Roman towns survived, their schools closed, their libraries fell to dust, and the skills of reading and writing became rarer with each generation. Without the flow of ideas to knit them together, communities turned inward, suspicious of outsiders and hungry for simple answers to complex problems. The Church stepped into this vacuum of power, offering unity and meaning amid chaos. But unity came at a price: conformity. Diversity of thought threatened stability. Unquestioning faith promised peace. And so, step by step, the Church's teachings became the sole filter through which knowledge passed. Ideas from the ancients were allowed to exist only if they reinforced doctrine. Those that challenged it were quietly ignored or declared heretical before they could spread. Yet, even as Europe darkened, whispers of the old knowledge lingered. A farmer might hear stories of men who once measured the stars or healed the sick with herbs unknown to local priests. A merchant could trade goods from lands where different ways of thinking survived. But these glimpses were fleeting, quickly smothered by fear or labeled blasphemy. Imagine walking through the ruins of a Roman amphitheater, weeds curling around broken columns. You see faint carvings of geometrical patterns, inscriptions of laws and philosophical musings. What would you feel? Knowing these stones once echoed with debates on ethics and natural law, but now stand silent, watched only by crows and the occasional monk passing on silent errands. This haunting silence was more than a pause in progress. It was a deliberate holding of breath, a continent suspended between remembering and forgetting. And in that silence, an unsettling question remains. Was it only the chaos of Rome's collapse that hid knowledge, or did someone find it more convenient to keep people in the dark? Even as monasteries multiplied, they also competed for relics and privileges granted by powerful bishops and kings. Control over sacred texts meant control over prestige, and often, wealth. Some abbots demanded exclusive ownership of copies of important manuscripts, threatening excommunication for anyone who dared replicate them without permission. These acts, recorded in surviving monastic chronicles, reveal a world where books were more valuable than gold, and secrecy could mean survival. Meanwhile, beyond Europe's shrinking horizons, the Islamic world was entering its own golden age. In cities like Baghdad, scholars translated Greek works into Arabic, preserving and expanding upon the very knowledge Europe was forgetting. Yet for most Europeans, this brilliance might as well have existed on the moon. The rivers of knowledge that once flowed freely from Athens to Rome now trickled into stagnant pools, hidden behind abbey walls. Was there a conscious plan among church leaders to keep knowledge secret? Or was it a more subtle web of incentives, fears, and traditions that ended up freezing thought? When you read medieval letters between abbots and bishops, they don't discuss conspiracies. They speak of keeping order, preserving purity of belief, and avoiding the confusion of many teachings. But isn't that, in itself, a reason to fear free ideas? These centuries saw the rise of the concept of heresy, not simply as false teaching, but as a threat to unity. An idea didn't need to be wrong to be dangerous. It only needed to make people think differently. And so, silence became a weapon. Better to keep a potential heretic ignorant than risk the spark of dissent. This was not a darkness of absolute ignorance, but of carefully curated knowledge, like a flame kept in a lamp, bright enough to see your own feet, but too dim to show the road ahead. And that, perhaps, was the greatest tragedy. The idea that knowledge was meant to guide only the few, not the many. As the first centuries after Rome's fall dragged on, Europe's political landscape hardened into a patchwork of fiefdoms, each ruled by lords who looked more to swords than to books for authority. Without shared learning to connect them, suspicion became the glue holding society together. Priests spoke of devils lurking in forests and miracles proving God's favor. There was no space for the careful, questioning minds of Greece and Rome, only stories to frighten or soothe. Yet even in this darkness, faint embers survived. A few scholars who risked accusations of witchcraft to study the old texts, merchants who brought scraps of forgotten works hidden in shipments from the East, isolated pockets of curiosity that refused to die. But each was easily crushed by a bishop's condemnation or a local lord's wrath. And so, for centuries, Europe lived with a profound contradiction. People prayed daily for divine wisdom, yet feared any knowledge that came from outside the accepted path. A continent once proud of its philosophers now treated independent thought as a poison. The same monasteries preserving books also became the judges deciding which truths were too dangerous to teach. Tonight, as you imagine those dark forests and crumbling stone halls, ask yourself, was the slow disappearance of knowledge a mere accident of history, or did someone, consciously or not, find a deeper safety in keeping the masses blind? Could the same impulse still echo in how power shapes information today? High on mist-shrouded hills, where the howling wind rattled ancient oaks, stood stone walls so thick they seemed built to withstand time itself. These were the monasteries of medieval Europe, silent fortresses of prayer, labor, and secrets. Inside, monks in plain robes moved like shadows, each step echoing through long, cold corridors. By day, they farmed and tended livestock. By night, they slipped into the scriptorium, a room that smelled of ink, wax, and musty parchment. Here, under flickering candlelight, they carefully copied words older than their oldest abbey stones. In these quiet chambers, monks became both the guardians and the jailers of knowledge. They preserved texts from Greece and Rome, but they also decided which ideas lived on and which faded into silence. Their scriptoria were filled with copies of Psalms, Gospels, and the writings of church fathers, but next to these sacred words rested Aristotle's treatises on logic, Galen's works on anatomy, or fragments of Euclid's geometry. Some abbeys collected entire libraries, others destroyed pages they deemed heretical. And so the monasteries became vaults, places where knowledge was kept safe from the outside world, but also hidden from it. The process was painfully slow. A single monk might spend a year painstakingly reproducing one manuscript. They wrote with quills dipped in oak gall ink, on vellum scraped from calfskin, every stroke deliberate and laborious. When they finished, their work was bound between wooden covers, wrapped in leather, then locked away in chests or chained to shelves to prevent theft. The result? Books so rare and precious they were worth more than gold. Yet outside those monastery walls, life was brutal and short. Most peasants never saw a book, let alone read one. Stories and teachings came from traveling priests who held the authority of the church. In a village where half the children died before reaching adulthood, survival, not knowledge, was the obsession of every day. Meanwhile, the monks' knowledge slumbered quietly behind stone walls, unread by the people it could have enlightened. What led monks to guard books so jealously? The answer lies partly in fear. Europe was a land beset by endless wars. Petty kings clashed over scraps of territory. Viking raiders appeared like ghosts from the sea, and disease swept through towns, leaving them empty and silent. In such a world, anything new or foreign was seen as a threat. By keeping knowledge contained, monasteries provided the anchor of stability, at the cost of intellectual stagnation. Monks also feared the corruption of ideas. They had seen how words could spark rebellion or sow doubt. Heresies spread like wildfire once a single radical thought took root. By controlling what was read and who could read, abbots believed they protected souls from dangerous paths. After all, to question the nature of God's creation could mean eternal damnation. It was better, many thought, to offer the faithful certainty, even if it meant suppressing ideas that might one day reveal deeper truths. But this secrecy bred its own darkness. In monasteries, knowledge became a currency of power. The more manuscripts an abbey held, the more status it commanded among fellow monastic orders and bishops. Some abbeys used rare texts to secure favor from nobles, promising prayers or alliances in exchange for protection. This trade in books turned learning into a game of leverage. Ideas were no longer treasures to be shared, but trophies to be hoarded. Imagine a cold winter night inside a mountain monastery, wind hissing through arrow-slit windows, candles guttering low, and a monk bent over a desk, copying lines from Plato by the dim light. His mind may wonder if he's saving these words for future generations, or burying them where they will never be read. Perhaps he wonders whether the wisdom he transcribes could ease the suffering outside these walls, or if sharing it would only bring ruin upon his brothers and himself. The paradox was bitter. Monks loved knowledge enough to spend their lives preserving it, yet feared it enough to keep it locked away. And so Europe remained suspended in a delicate silence, where wisdom slumbered but could not awaken. Meanwhile, the Church's hierarchy reinforced this arrangement. Bishops and abbots corresponded in Latin, a language increasingly foreign to common folk. Even kings often needed clerics to read letters aloud. Latin wasn't just a tongue of tradition. It was a barrier, a way to ensure knowledge stayed within the educated elite. Those who spoke it could move among the powerful. Those who didn't were condemned to ignorance. The monasteries also became the first organized networks of information since Rome's collapse. A scriptorium in northern France might request copies of a manuscript held in Italy, and monks would send messengers across dangerous roads. But these exchanges happened solely within church circles. Knowledge rarely slipped into secular hands, and when it did, it often came heavily edited to align with theology. In these cloisters, ideas were filtered carefully. If Aristotle spoke of an eternal universe, monks annotated it to explain God's creation of time. If Galen described human anatomy contradicting medieval beliefs, scribes might omit or modify passages. Over generations, this editorial zeal turned ancient works into distorted echoes of their original brilliance, safe enough not to threaten orthodoxy, yet still bearing a faint spark of genius. But it wasn't only ancient philosophers who suffered this fate. Even new ideas born in Europe often died young. An innovator proposing a theory outside accepted teaching risked being labeled heretic. For most, the price of curiosity was too high. Better to stay silent, better to accept the world as it was preached. It is easy now to look back and condemn this fear of knowledge, but we must remember the times. Plague, famine, and constant war left people desperate for certainty. The church offered answers when chaos reigned, and monks believed they guarded civilization itself. But the same guardianship that kept texts from the flames also kept them from minds that might have used them to change the world sooner. And yet deep within the monasteries, a quiet rebellion sometimes flickered. Some monks copied forbidden texts secretly, passing them hand to hand. Others added subtle marginal notes questioning accepted views. These whispers of dissent rarely left the cloister, but they proved that curiosity could not be entirely smothered. Consider the story of a monk in 12th century Ireland who, reading old Greek works, scribbled a note. These words speak truths I dare not tell. His marginalia survives today, a small, defiant voice echoing across centuries. It reminds us that even in the deepest darkness, sparks of questioning continued to glow. As decades rolled into centuries, the monasteries' role as both vaults and prisons of knowledge became ever clearer. The Renaissance would later hail them as heroes for saving classical texts. But few dared ask why those texts had been hidden for so long in the first place. When we wander today through silent monastic ruins, arches crumbling under moss, cloisters where light filters through broken stone, we feel both gratitude and unease. Gratitude that these places preserved priceless works, unease at how easily knowledge can be confined by fear. Tonight, imagine walking the icy halls of a medieval abbey, the air heavy with centuries of silence. Ask yourself, were the monks selfless guardians waiting for better days, or cautious wardens who kept the light just dim enough to maintain control? Perhaps they were both. Human beings like us, torn between hope for a wiser future and terror of the chaos that unbridled truth might bring. In the stillness of the Italian night, under skies deeper and darker than any cathedral vault, a man stood alone with his eye pressed to a slender tube of glass and wood. The stars above Pisa shimmered like distant fires, indifferent to the turmoil below. The man was Galileo Galilei, and in that moment, he was seeing something no one else had dared or been able to see. A universe far larger, messier, and more wondrous than any scripture or authority had ever admitted. Galileo's telescope, a humble-looking instrument, became the most dangerous object in Europe. With it, he revealed that the moon was not a perfect polished sphere, but a pocked, cratered landscape like Earth itself. He saw moons circling Jupiter, proof that not everything revolved around our world. He tracked phases of Venus that could only happen if planets orbited the sun. Each discovery was a silent dagger aimed at a belief system that insisted Earth, and by extension humanity, sat at the center of everything. But why did these revelations frighten so many? To modern ears, the idea of Earth moving around the sun sounds like simple science, yet in Galileo's time, it was an assault on the very foundation of meaning. If Earth wasn't the center, where did that leave humankind? If the heavens were flawed and changeable, what else might be uncertain? The Church's power rested not just on spiritual authority, but on the promise of order. A cosmos with Earth fixed at its center reflected a society where kings ruled by divine right and priests spoke with unchallengeable certainty. Galileo's observations threatened more than astronomy. They threatened a delicate hierarchy that had kept Europe's chaos contained for centuries. Galileo tried to tread carefully. He dedicated his starry messenger to powerful patrons. He argued that science and faith could coexist if both sought truth. But whispers spread among theologians that his ideas undermined Scripture itself. Verses describing a stable earth became points of fierce contention. Debates erupted in cloisters and university halls, carried by rumors faster than any printing press. Soon, Galileo's struggle moved from silent nights at the telescope to shadowed halls of interrogation. Summoned before the Roman Inquisition, he found himself surrounded by men in red and black robes, men who saw his discoveries not as marvels, but as heresy. They demanded he renounce his belief in heliocentrism, the idea that Earth orbited the sun. Galileo, a man who had charted moons and measured stars, now stood before a tribunal that refused to look through his telescope. The most famous scientist in Europe, reduced to pleading for his life, realized that evidence alone could not conquer fear. The trial became theater. An old man, weary but defiant, accused of undermining God's perfect creation. He argued that God's book of nature could not contradict the book of Scripture when rightly understood. But the inquisitors had little interest in reconciling ideas. They wanted obedience. In 1633, Galileo was forced to kneel and publicly deny the truth he had seen with his own eyes. Legend holds that as he rose, he whispered, "Eppur si muove," and yet it moves. Whether he actually said those words or not, they captured a defiant spirit that refused to die even when the body bowed. Why did the Church respond with such severity? Because Galileo's work touched a nerve deeper than any heretical pamphlet. He showed that knowledge was not the property of ancient texts, but something each person could seek through observation and reason. He taught that the universe could reveal its secrets to anyone willing to look carefully. That simple idea threatened to unseat centuries of rigid authority. It's easy now to admire Galileo as a martyr for science, but he was also a master of survival. Even after his condemnation, he continued to write, under house arrest, smuggling manuscripts to publishers in Protestant lands. His later work, discourses and mathematical demonstrations relating to two new sciences, laid the foundations for modern physics. He proved that ideas could travel further than the men who first thought them. Imagine standing in Galileo's workshop, scattered with hand-ground lenses, notes scribbled in haste, diagrams of moons and orbits pinned to rough wooden walls. Picture the flicker of candlelight reflecting in his eyes as he tracked Jupiter's moons night after night, knowing each observation brought him closer to both discovery and danger. His bravery inspired others. Across Europe, scientists and philosophers began to wonder what else lay hidden behind inherited assumptions. If the Church could be wrong about the structure of the universe, what else might it misunderstand? These questions ignited small rebellions of thought in minds as far apart as England, France, and the Netherlands. Yet Galileo's fate also taught caution. Scholars learned to cloak their work in careful words, to preface treatises with lengthy dedications to princes and cardinals, to frame discoveries as harmless curiosities rather than radical ideas. They learned to survive, but the price was often silence. The paradox deepened. The telescope that could reveal the grandeur of Jupiter's moons also magnified Europe's fears. Galileo's instrument became a symbol of possibility and peril, a reminder that knowledge, once seen, cannot be unseen, yet can be punished. Meanwhile, many ordinary Europeans heard only rumors of the trial. They knew the church had judged a man who claimed Earth moved, but few understood what that meant. What spread was a feeling, a subtle chill that to question official teachings could bring ruin. This quiet dread, more than any decree, helped keep minds in line. Even so, tiny cracks appeared in the great wall of conformity. Merchants brought back strange maps from overseas. Sailors told tales of new stars in southern skies. These small details unsettled the old certainties. Combined with Galileo's legacy, they hinted at a world more vast and mysterious than any sermon described. Galileo's life forces us to ask, was it his observations that made him dangerous, or was it his insistence that anyone could seek the same truths he did? His telescope was not magic. It was accessible technology. His math was not sorcery. It was logic. By making knowledge something ordinary people might grasp, he shifted the balance of power. Tonight, imagine yourself in the garden of a Tuscan villa, stars wheeling above you, a telescope resting on a wooden tripod. As you peer through the glass, you see the rough shadows on the moon, the dance of Jupiter's moons. You feel the wonder Galileo felt, but also the risk he took. You realize knowledge is never just facts. It's a challenge to every story we've been told about our place in the universe. As the Church's condemnation of Galileo echoed across Europe, it became a signal, both warning and invitation. Warning, because it showed the price of challenging orthodoxy. Invitation, because it whispered that truth might lie beyond those rigid walls. In the end, Galileo's story wasn't just about stars or planets, but about courage and fear, hope and repression. It asked a question that remains urgent today. Do we dare to look beyond what we're told, even when the cost is high? Or do we find comfort in the darkness of unquestioned certainties? In the heart of Rome, where narrow alleys twist like veins around ancient stones, stands a square whose cobblestones have drunk more tears than rain. Campo de Fiori, Field of Flowers, is today a place of markets and laughter, but once it witnessed a scene so brutal, it seared itself into Europe's memory forever. There, on a February morning in 1600, a pyre rose above a hushed crowd, and in its flames burned Giordano Bruno, a man who dared to speak of a universe infinite and teeming with countless worlds. Bruno was no cautious scholar. Unlike Galileo, who tried to reconcile faith with science, Bruno was a comet blazing straight through the dogmas of his age. Born near Naples, he joined a Dominican monastery as a young man, where he devoured philosophy, mathematics, and astrology. But the more he read, the more restless he grew. He saw contradictions in teachings that described a fixed, ordered cosmos centered on Earth. To him, the infinite felt more true than any comforting illusion. He traveled across Europe, from Geneva to Paris to London, surviving on lectures and patronage. He debated openly with the greatest minds of his time, leaving a trail of admiration, fear, and anger. Bruno taught that the stars were other suns, each with their own worlds, that the universe had no edge, that God's creation was boundless. In these ideas, he shattered a medieval worldview that found safety in a closed, finite cosmos. But Bruno's heresies went deeper than astronomy. He questioned the Trinity, denied the virgin birth, and declared Christ merely a great magician, not divine. He rejected the very heart of Catholic orthodoxy, turning admiration into outrage. For some, His words promised liberation from rigid doctrines. For others, they sounded like a devil's whisper. As Bruno's reputation grew, so did the Church's determination to silence him. In 1592, he was arrested by the Venetian Inquisition, then transferred to Rome to face trial. For 8 years, he languished in prison, interrogated, tortured, offered chances to recant. Yet Bruno refused. He would not betray what he saw as the limitless glory of creation. His trial became a spectacle, both feared and whispered about across Europe. Cardinals weighed not just his fate, but the meaning of his ideas. If the universe was infinite, how could God's plan be centered solely on humanity? If other worlds existed, were there other souls? Other Christs? The questions Bruno raised threatened to unravel not just theology, but the entire moral and social order. On February 17, 1600, Bruno was led to the stake. Witnesses described him walking steadily, head high, eyes fierce. A metal clamp forced his tongue still, a final cruelty to stop him from speaking as flames consumed him. And yet his silence thundered louder than any words. The smoke rising from Campo de' Fiori carried more than the scent of charred flesh. It carried a warning and a question that would haunt generations. For the Church, Bruno's execution was both a demonstration of power and an act of desperation. By burning him, they sought to cauterize the wound his ideas had opened in the collective mind. But instead of erasing his influence, they turned him into a martyr, a symbol that reason could be killed, but not defeated. Why did the Church fear Bruno so deeply? It wasn't simply his denial of dogma, it was his challenge to human exceptionalism. Medieval theology taught that God made the cosmos for mankind, placing Earth at its center as the stage of salvation. Bruno's infinite universe suggested humanity was just one small note in an endless symphony, a terrifying thought to those who based their power on certainty. Imagine standing in that square at dawn, the sky pale and silent, the pyre's ashes still warm. Would you feel vindication or horror? Would you believe you'd witnessed justice or a crime against truth? These are questions Europe wrestled with for centuries, and they remain relevant wherever ideas threaten entrenched power. Bruno's death sent shockwaves through scholars across Europe. Some recoiled, retreating into safe studies and cautious treatises. Others found in his fate a dark inspiration. If ideas were so dangerous that they warranted execution, perhaps they were also powerful enough to reshape the world. Bruno himself was neither a careful scientist nor a systematic philosopher. His writings could be chaotic, his style flamboyant, his theories speculative. But he possessed something rarer than precision, an unflinching courage to follow questions to their furthest horizons. He refused to limit thought to what was comfortable or permitted. His radicalism forced contemporaries to reconsider old assumptions. Even those who hated his conclusions found themselves grappling with his arguments. He cracked open minds already strained by the contradictions of a world both expanding and bound by medieval beliefs. While Galileo would later face trial for evidence-based observations, Bruno died for possibilities. Ideas that could not yet be tested, but refused to stay quiet. He embodied the truth that sometimes what terrifies authorities most is not proof, but imagination. Bruno's story also reveals how power and fear work together to police thought. The Church's need for order made dissent dangerous. The violent example of punishment made fear contagious. In a society where survival depended on obedience, a single pyre could keep thousands silent. Yet even in death, Bruno's ideas escaped. His books, banned but secretly copied, traveled hidden in wagons and under cloaks. In them, curious minds discovered visions of a cosmos where the divine was infinite and freedom of thought sacred. These seeds, planted in hushed corners of Europe, would one day help spark revolutions in science and philosophy. Today, a statue of Giordano Bruno stands tall in Campo de' Fiori, his hooded figure gazing sternly at the Vatican. Erected in 1889 by Italian intellectuals, it defies the centuries of silence that followed his execution. At its unveiling, church leaders protested fiercely, recognizing even then that his memory still challenged their authority. As you stand before that statue today, tourists laughing around you, market stalls selling fruit and flowers, it is easy to forget that here a man once burned for daring to imagine an endless sky. But if you look into his bronze eyes, you might feel the heat of the fire that tried and failed to consume his ideas. Bruno's life forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. What do we sacrifice to keep our beliefs safe from change? Are we willing to silence others so we don't have to face truths that might unseat our certainties? And do we have the courage, as he did, to follow questions wherever they lead, even into darkness? Tonight, as you stare up at the stars Bruno once dreamed of, remember that for much of history, to gaze too deeply at the heavens was an act of rebellion. Remember that each point of light above us stands witness to a universe too vast for any single doctrine. And remember the man who stood unbowed before the flames, declaring with his life that truth is infinite, and the mind's reach should be too. In the candlelit silence of Europe's monasteries, many believed the ancient wisdom of Greece and Rome had been lost forever. But far to the east and south, beyond deserts and mountains, those ideas were not just preserved, they were reborn, refined, and expanded. While Europe drifted through centuries of turmoil, a different world flourished, the Islamic Golden Age. And it was from these distant cities, under stars that also guided caravans and sailors, that a quiet wave of knowledge began its journey back to Europe. In cities like Baghdad, Damascus, and Cordoba, scholars gathered in great libraries and bustling schools. Here, under the patronage of caliphs and emirs, men and women translated Greek texts into Arabic, commented on them, and pushed their ideas further. Mathematics, medicine, astronomy, philosophy, fields that lay dormant in Europe, thrived here like oases in the intellectual desert. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad was one such marvel, a sprawling complex where scholars of different faiths, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, even Zoroastrian, worked side by side. They pored over the writings of Aristotle, Hippocrates, Ptolemy, and Archimedes, debating them with a rigor Europe hadn't seen in centuries. These thinkers didn't just copy old texts. They innovated, correcting errors, introducing new theories, and applying ancient ideas to the challenges of their own time. Arabic mathematicians invented algebra. Persian physicians wrote medical texts that would become standard references in Europe for centuries. Astronomers like Al-Biruni measured Earth's circumference with astonishing accuracy. Philosophers like Avicenna explored metaphysics and logic, weaving Greek thought into an Islamic framework. And while Europe feared the night sky, these scholars mapped stars, built observatories, and imagined an ordered cosmos governed by discoverable laws. But how did these treasures of knowledge return to Europe's darkened shores? The first cracks in Europe's intellectual isolation appeared during the Reconquista in Spain and the Crusades in the eastern Mediterranean. In Toledo, a Spanish city retaken from Muslim rule in the 11th century, Christian rulers discovered magnificent libraries filled with books in Arabic. They realized that, locked within these volumes, was the wisdom of the ancients they had thought lost. A movement of translators sprang up in Toledo, drawn from every faith. Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars worked together, translating texts from Arabic into Latin. Figures like Gerard of Cremona devoted their lives to rendering hundreds of scientific and philosophical works accessible to Europe again. These translators became the hidden bridge through which Aristotle, Galen, and Ptolemy walked back into the European mind. Imagine a room in Toledo's Alcazar, lamplit, scrolls and codices piled high, three men arguing over a Greek concept rendered in Arabic and now seeking the right Latin words. Their debates were not just about grammar, they were battles for meaning, precision, and truth. Each word, chosen carefully, could open or close the doors of understanding for generations to come. Soon, these newly translated texts spread from Spain to Italy, France, and beyond. They entered cathedral schools and the nascent universities of Paris and Bologna, shocking European scholars with the depth and breadth of ancient and Islamic knowledge. For many, it was as if a bright light had pierced the fog of their world. Yet this flood of ideas brought both excitement and fear. Some clergy welcomed Aristotle's logic as a tool to clarify theology. Others recoiled, seeing in these foreign texts seeds of heresy. Debates raged in lecture halls and church councils. Could reason stand alongside faith? Or did it threaten to topple the fragile tower of belief? Many powerful churchmen sought to control this new wave of thought. Some texts were banned or placed on lists of suspicious works. Others were allowed, but only with heavy commentary to align them with church doctrine. But the ideas had taken root, and no decree could pull them out. One of the most striking examples of this tension was Peter Abelard, a 12th century French philosopher who embraced Aristotle's logic with fearless enthusiasm. Abelard applied reason to questions of faith, daring to suggest that even divine mysteries should withstand scrutiny. His book, Sic et Non, Yes and No, laid out theological contradictions side by side, challenging readers to think rather than obey blindly. For this, he was condemned, forced into monastic seclusion, but his influence rippled through generations. Meanwhile, the universities sprouting across Europe became fertile ground for these reintroduced ideas. At first, universities were tools of the church, training priests and lawyers. But as translations spread, these institutions evolved into arenas of intellectual combat. Masters and students debated Aristotle's theories of motion, Avicenna's metaphysics, and Galen's descriptions of the body. Arguments spilled from lecture halls into city streets, where crowds gathered to hear challenges to truths once thought unassailable. The reappearance of ancient knowledge also ignited passions outside scholarly circles. Merchants saw practical uses. Arabic numerals made accounting faster and more accurate than cumbersome Roman numerals. Architects borrowed geometrical principles to build cathedrals that reached skyward with daring grace. Doctors applied new medical theories that, while imperfect, advanced care beyond medieval superstition. Yet, even as knowledge brought progress, it also sharpened conflicts. Conservative theologians feared that too much reason would lead to pride, doubt, and rebellion. Radical thinkers whispered that reason alone could explain the world, that perhaps faith was no longer needed at all. Europe trembled between these poles, caught in a dangerous dance of enlightenment and reaction. Through all this, the memory of the Islamic scholars who preserved and expanded classical learning was often ignored or even erased in Europe's histories. The Church, wary of acknowledging debt to a rival faith, downplayed the origin of these ideas. But the truth lingered in the margins of manuscripts, in Arabic words woven into Latin texts, in the very shape of Europe's new understanding of the cosmos. Imagine standing in the courtyard of a Toledo monastery, cool night air brushing your face as a scholar reads from a fresh Latin translation of Avicenna. The words carry echoes of Baghdad's lecture halls, of dusty libraries in Samarkand, of observatories in Cairo, each sentence crossing centuries and continents, carrying a spark that would ignite the Renaissance. This great return of knowledge forced Europe to face uncomfortable questions. If wisdom could come from lands deemed infidel, what else might those lands hold? If truths long forgotten could resurface from beyond Christendom, were there other truths Europe had yet to uncover, or dared not? As translations multiplied, they did more than bring old ideas back. They planted seeds of intellectual curiosity. Europeans began to look outward, to Africa, to Asia, to the stars above. Exploration, science, and philosophy all drew strength from this rediscovered foundation. The medieval worldview, narrow, hierarchical, and absolute, cracked under the weight of possibilities, and yet even as minds opened, resistance grew fierce. By the 13th century, church councils condemned certain interpretations of Aristotle. Thinkers like Thomas Aquinas worked tirelessly to reconcile faith with reason, crafting elaborate arguments to show that Aristotle's logic could coexist with Christian belief. But Aquinas' very need to defend this synthesis showed how threatened the church felt. Tonight, as you imagine the bustling streets of medieval Toledo, lanterns swaying, voices in Latin, Arabic, and Hebrew mingling in dark alleys, consider the fragile chain by which knowledge travels. Consider how easily it can be broken, how many times it almost was, and how each generation depends on the courage of translators, teachers, and readers willing to defy silence. In the quiet morning haze of October 31st, 1517, a lone monk approached the doors of All Saints' Church in Wittenberg, Germany. In his hands, he carried a hammer, some nails, and a document that would forever alter the course of European history. Martin Luther's 95 Theses, nailed to those heavy wooden doors, were more than an academic challenge. They were a thunderclap that shattered centuries of unquestioned authority. What drove Luther, an Augustinian friar, to such audacity? He had spent years tormented by questions of sin, salvation, and the apparent gulf between God's love and the rigid rules of the church. But what finally pushed him beyond fear was the sale of indulgences, documents sold by church officials promising forgiveness of sins in exchange for money. Luther saw this as spiritual extortion, a cruel exploitation of desperate souls terrified of damnation. His 95 Theses were written in Latin, intended at first as an invitation to scholarly debate. But the timing was explosive. Gutenberg's printing press, perfected just decades earlier, allowed copies to spread far beyond Wittenberg. Soon, Luther's words were read in taverns, markets, and town squares from Germany to Italy. Ordinary people who had never before questioned church practices began to wonder if priests had lied, if salvation could not be bought, and if faith alone might be enough. The church's initial reaction was disbelief, followed quickly by fury. Luther was summoned to Augsburg to answer for his writings. There he faced the formidable Cardinal Cajetan, who demanded he recant. Luther refused. He argued that Scripture, not the Pope or councils, was the highest authority in matters of faith. This radical idea undercut the very foundation of ecclesiastical power. But what terrified church leaders even more was how quickly Luther's ideas spread. Printed pamphlets carried his words into the hands of artisans, merchants, and farmers. People long kept ignorant of theology now debated grace, penance, and freedom. The printing press became Luther's secret weapon, churning out thousands of pages faster than the church could condemn them. For the first time, ideas moved faster than authority. Imagine the tension in a village square, where a tinker reads aloud Luther's tract to a crowd that hangs on every word. Each sentence sparks arguments, alliances, and suspicions. Friends become foes. Neighbors form secret gatherings to study the Bible in their own language. The Reformation wasn't just a theological debate, it was a social revolution ignited by a monk's hammer and the power of the printed page. In 1521, Luther was excommunicated. Emperor Charles V summoned him to the Diet of Worms, a grand assembly of princes, bishops, and imperial officers. There, Luther stood alone, the world's eyes upon him. When ordered to retract his writings, he replied with words that still ring through history. "Unless I am convinced by Scripture and plain reason, I cannot and will not recant. Here I stand. I can do no other." It was a declaration of intellectual independence more powerful than any army. The Church's decision to outlaw Luther only made him a hero to many. German princes saw in his rebellion an opportunity to assert their own independence from Rome. Peasants saw hope for social justice in his ideas. Reformers across Europe took courage, launching movements that splintered Christendom into rival churches. But the Reformation also unleashed chaos. In Luther's wake, radicals rose who took his ideas further than he ever intended. Peasant revolts erupted, inspired by a reading of Scripture that called for equality and justice. Luther, horrified by the violence, condemned the rebels. But the fires had already spread. The unity of Europe's faith shattered into sharp shards of Protestant and Catholic camps, often at war with each other. Behind this upheaval lay the quiet might of the printing press. Gutenberg's invention had already challenged the Church's monopoly on books. But Luther proved how powerful the press could be as a tool of dissent. Pamphlets, songs, woodcut illustrations, Reformation propaganda flooded Europe. Images of corrupt bishops hoarding gold or devils whispering into the Pope's ear inflamed the masses more effectively than sermons ever could. Yet this democratization of information came with costs. Alongside serious theological debate, wild rumors spread that the Pope was the Antichrist, that Luther had miraculous powers, that the end of the world was near. Fear and hope mingled dangerously. The very force that broke the silence also made truth harder to discern. Meanwhile, Rome responded with fire and iron. The Inquisition expanded, rooting out heresy with ruthless efficiency. Reformers were burned, beheaded, or forced into hiding. But the harder the church struck, the more determined the Reformation became. New Protestant sects appeared almost overnight, each with its own reading of Scripture, its own leaders, its own vision of faith. Across the continent, families were torn apart by belief. Some converted to Luther's ideas, others stayed loyal to Rome. Princes chose sides, calculating spiritual conviction and political advantage in equal measure. Battles broke out. Cities changed faith with the fortunes of war. Europe plunged into a century of conflict that would reshape maps and mentalities alike. And yet, despite bloodshed and terror, something irreversible had begun. Ordinary people now believed they had the right to read, think, and decide for themselves. The Reformation turned Europe into a continent of readers as demand for Bibles and tracts exploded. Literacy rates climbed, and with them, the expectation that each soul should stand alone before God and truth. Imagine holding a freshly printed German Bible, still smelling of ink and leather, reading words once restricted to priests. The sense of empowerment, the realization that divine wisdom was not the sole property of a distant hierarchy. This was Luther's true revolution. But did Luther intend such sweeping change? In many ways, he remained a medieval man. He never questioned the divine right of kings, and he insisted on suppressing dissenters who challenged his own interpretations. Yet his refusal to bow at Worms broke the spell of absolute obedience. He proved that an individual, armed with conviction and a clear voice, could confront institutions that had stood unchallenged for a millennium. Tonight, picture yourself standing at the doors of Wittenberg's church, where hammer blows once echoed like thunder. Feel the tremor in the air as parchment meets wood. Sense the invisible shockwave rolling out across fields, towns, and kingdoms. This was not just the start of Protestantism, it was the moment Europe learned that authority could be questioned and truth could come from even the humblest monk. And ask yourself, what walls today would you dare to nail your own theses upon? What ideas lie waiting for someone bold enough to speak them into the silence? In the dim workshop of a humble goldsmith in 15th century Mainz, Germany, a new sound began to echo. The rhythmic clack of metal type, the soft rustle of damp paper, the creak of a wooden press. It was a sound that would ripple across continents and centuries. The heartbeat of Johannes Gutenberg's invention, the printing press with movable type. More than any sword or army, this machine would prove to be the most powerful weapon ever unleashed against ignorance and control. Before Gutenberg, every book was a labor of devotion or drudgery. Monks hunched in scriptoria, copying line by painstaking line, producing perhaps a few dozen volumes in a lifetime. Books were rare and staggeringly expensive. A single Bible might cost more than a skilled craftsman could earn in 20 years. Knowledge traveled slowly, chained by scarcity. Ideas could be smothered simply by refusing to copy them. Gutenberg changed that forever. By casting individual letters in metal and arranging them to form words, he made it possible to print hundreds of identical pages in the time it once took to write a single one. His press multiplied knowledge at a scale no one had imagined. A single workshop could produce thousands of books, each a silent messenger carrying ideas to places the church's reach could never fully control. The church at first welcomed this marvel, seeing in it a faster way to spread the Bible and catechisms. But they soon realized the press was a double-edged sword. Alongside religious texts came pamphlets, poems, heretical tracts, and political manifestos. Control over knowledge slipped through ink-stained fingers as pages crossed borders and minds faster than bishops or kings could issue decrees. Imagine standing in Gutenberg's workshop at night, the smell of ink thick in the air, sheets of parchment drying on ropes above your head, apprentices setting lines of type by candlelight. Every word laid in lead promised to echo farther than any sermon shouted from a pulpit. Each printed page was a small act of rebellion against silence. This technology arrived at a moment of profound tension. Europe, rattled by Luther's defiance, was desperate to reassert authority. But the printing press spread his ideas faster than any horse or herald could chase them down. One historian later wrote that Luther's Reformation was as much the triumph of the printing press as of theology itself. The machine turned words into an unstoppable flood. The authorities tried to dam the torrent. Edicts demanded printers register every book with local bishops. Censors combed shops for unapproved texts. Secret police raided cellars, where forbidden works were stored. But every crackdown only confirmed the power of the printed word, and the hunger people felt for ideas denied them. Printers, many of them skilled artisans who once engraved images on metal, quickly learned they could profit from controversy. Seditious pamphlets sold like wildfire. News of executions, battles, or royal scandals appeared in broad sheets read aloud in taverns. Ordinary men and women who once knew only what their parish priest told them began to learn about events hundreds of miles away. But this wave of knowledge came with both light and shadow. False rumors could spread as fast as truths. Satirical cartoons painted enemies with horns and tails, inflaming hatreds. Competing faiths printed rival Bibles, each claiming to be the only true word of God. Information was freed, but so were fear, rage, and confusion. The power of print reshaped not just minds, but cities. Book fairs bloomed in places like Frankfurt, where merchants traded thousands of volumes alongside spices, cloth, and silver. These fairs became crossroads of commerce and culture, where printers, scholars, and spies rubbed shoulders. Ideas leaked across languages and borders with every handshake. Consider a traveler at a 16th century fair. In one stall, he finds a new edition of Erasmus's satirical attacks on church corruption. In another, a daring treatise challenging the divine right of kings. He slips copies into his saddlebags, carrying them home to friends who gather in candle-lit rooms to read aloud what no priest would dare to preach. Yet the printing press was more than a vehicle for revolution. It was also a mirror reflecting the contradictions of Europe. The same technology that spread Luther's defiance also printed the church's rebuttals. Pamphlet wars raged, each side issuing ever sharper arguments and insults. Printers sometimes switched allegiances overnight, driven less by conviction than by profit. In the hands of unscrupulous men, the press spread libels and hoaxes. Sensational pamphlets told of witches flying to midnight Sabbaths, of monstrous births signaling God's wrath. Panic often followed, leading to witch hunts and massacres. The power of the press to shape reality could heal ignorance or feed it. Meanwhile, in quieter corners, humanists used the new technology to resurrect the classics. Erasmus edited and printed works of Cicero and Plato, laying the intellectual groundwork for the Renaissance. Books of anatomy illustrated with detailed woodcuts challenged medieval ideas about the body. Navigators published maps that reimagined the world's shape. Step by step, Europe's mental horizons expanded. The press also changed education. Grammar schools and universities multiplied as books became affordable enough to stock libraries. Literacy rates, once stagnant for centuries, rose steadily. Even peasants' children sometimes learned to read, and with reading came a sense of personal worth and possibility. The church tried to adapt. It created its own presses, producing catechisms and saints' lives in local languages to hold believers' loyalty. The index of forbidden books was expanded, listing works Catholics were banned from reading, but the sheer volume of material overwhelmed every attempt at control. Books printed in Antwerp or Geneva appeared in Paris and Rome within weeks, hidden in wagons of wool or barrels of wine. Imagine a village priest in rural France, opening a package sent by a distant cousin, only to find a copy of Calvin's Institutes tucked among mundane letters. He reads it in secret, heart pounding with both curiosity and terror, knowing that knowledge could set him free or doom him. Printers themselves became the new hidden couriers of change. Many were hunted, fined, or imprisoned, but their presses moved when threatened, reappearing in new cities with fresh typefaces and sharper ideas. The underground network of printers and booksellers proved harder to root out than any army of rebels. The rise of printed news reshaped how people understood time and events. Before, villagers learned of a king's death or a distant war months or years after they happened. Now, news sheets, early newspapers, delivered stories of far-off events within days. A commoner could follow a prince's marriage, a bishop's downfall, or a peasant revolt in another country. The sense of belonging to a wider world, unimaginable a century before, took root. And so, the printing press birthed something new: public opinion. Once ideas moved beyond the control of pulpit and court, rulers found themselves forced to consider the voices of people who had never before mattered. Monarchs issued proclamations not just to nobles, but to their subjects, aware that the press could praise or mock their every move. By the late 16th century, the press had grown so influential that both Protestant and Catholic leaders used it not merely to attack each other, but to define their own identities. Printed catechisms, hymnals, and confessions of faith solidified new denominations. Each book became a stone in the walls of Europe's religious and cultural divisions. Tonight, imagine standing in a printer's workshop, hearing the press creak and the type strike. Realize that every sheet pulled from the press carries the potential to challenge tyrants, inspire revolutions, or twist truth into nightmare. The printing press was not merely a machine, it was a forge where Europe's future was hammered out letter by letter. And as you listen to the echo of that hammering in the back of your mind, ask yourself, in our own age of instant information, what stories are we letting shape us? And do we still remember how powerful words can be when they're finally freed? As Europe staggered from the storms of Reformation and religious wars, the dust settled on a continent scarred by blood but hungry for understanding. From the chaos emerged a new question. If centuries of dogma and conflict had failed to deliver peace and certainty, might there be another path? One built on reason, observation, and the power of human thought? This question ignited the period we now call the Enlightenment. It began quietly in the salons of Paris, the coffee houses of London, the lecture halls of Berlin. There, philosophers, scientists, and skeptics gathered to debate truths once guarded jealously by priests and kings. And though their conversations were often dangerous, they carried a conviction. Knowledge should belong not to the few, but to all. One towering figure of this awakening was René Descartes. Alone in a cold room in the Netherlands, he sat by candlelight and dared to doubt everything, except the fact of his own thinking mind. His words, cogito, ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, became a rallying cry for intellectual independence. Descartes showed that the human mind, unaided by tradition or authority, could discover truths through reason alone. Soon the torch passed to thinkers like Baruch Spinoza, who argued that nature and God were one, and that understanding the laws of the universe was a path to understanding the divine itself. His radical ideas led to excommunication and exile, but they spread nonetheless, whispered among scholars who found in them a daring new vision of freedom. Meanwhile, in England, Isaac Newton peered into the night sky and saw a grand, ordered clockwork. In his Principia Mathematica, he revealed laws of motion and universal gravitation, proof that the cosmos operated according to principles that human reason could uncover. Where medieval minds saw mysteries to be feared, Newton saw patterns to be measured. His work unified the heavens and earth under one set of laws, banishing the need for miracles to explain the movements of stars and tides. Newton's discoveries didn't just rewrite physics, they transformed philosophy. If natural laws governed the universe, might similar principles guide human societies? Could reason tame the chaos of politics, economics, and morality? These questions inspired a generation of thinkers we know as the philosophes. In Paris, Voltaire's sharp pen exposed the cruelty of kings and the hypocrisy of clerics. His satires cut deep, but his vision of tolerance and reason lit fires in minds across Europe. In Geneva, Jean-Jacques Rousseau dreamed of social contracts built not on divine right, but on the collective will of free citizens. In Scotland, David Hume challenged dogmas about miracles, arguing that belief must rest on evidence, not authority. These ideas spread like wildfire thanks to an invention of the Enlightenment, the encyclopedia. Edited by Denis Diderot and Jean-Laurent d'Alembert, the Encyclopédie sought to collect all human knowledge, organizing it not by church doctrine or royal decree, but by logic and observation. Published in dozens of volumes, it brought the latest discoveries in science, technology, and philosophy into the hands of thousands of readers. Each entry challenged the notion that truth belonged to the powerful. Imagine leafing through a leather-bound volume of the Encyclopédie by the light of a single candle, discovering diagrams of machines, treatises on liberty, and essays on the rights of man. The book felt like a secret map to a freer world, one where superstition no longer ruled, and every individual could seek knowledge without permission. But the Enlightenment's power did not go unchallenged. Monarchs and priests fought to silence its voices. Books were banned. Writers were imprisoned or exiled. Yet censorship only heightened curiosity. Forbidden texts were smuggled across borders, hidden in barrels of flour or sewn into the linings of coats. Ordinary people began to demand more than survival. They sought dignity, rights, and a say in how they were governed. As these ideas took root, they transformed hearts as well as minds. Women like Mary Wollstonecraft stepped forward, arguing that reason was not the province of men alone. Her vindication of the rights of woman insisted that education and liberty must extend to all. Meanwhile, salons, hosted by women like Madame Geoffrin and Madame de Staël, became crucibles of thought. In these glittering gatherings, nobles and philosophers argued ideas too dangerous to utter in public. Across Europe, coffee houses buzzed with debates about sovereignty, science, and faith. The Enlightenment gave birth to a new hero, the scientist-philosopher who challenged both superstition and tyranny. But it also birthed a new villain, the demagogue who could twist reason into justification for violence. As radical ideas spread, so did the risk of chaos. Revolutions loomed, fueled by words that had slipped beyond the control of kings. In America, colonists inspired by Enlightenment ideals declared their independence, writing of self-evident truths and unalienable rights. Across the ocean, France seethed with anger at royal excess and clerical privilege. Pamphlets bearing Rousseau's ideas circulated among artisans and peasants, whispering that sovereignty lay not in crowns, but in the people's will. The storm broke in 1789. As revolution swept through Paris, the Bastille fell, and the old order crumbled. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen proclaimed liberty and equality as natural rights, words unthinkable just a century earlier. Yet the Enlightenment's promise was no guarantee. The same revolution that ended feudal privilege soon turned on itself, descending into terror. Enlightened ideals became weapons in the hands of those who claimed to speak for reason, even as they silenced dissent with the blade. The guillotine cast a dark shadow over dreams of universal liberty. Across Europe, monarchs took note. Some, like Frederick the Great of Prussia, styled themselves enlightened despots, adopting reforms in law and education while maintaining absolute power. Others cracked down harder than ever, fearing ideas more than armies. But despite reversals and bloodshed, the course of history had shifted irrevocably. A world had been born where questioning authority was no longer a sin, but a right. Where knowledge printed and shared was more powerful than any decree. Where individuals could imagine a future not handed down by tradition, but built by human hands and minds. Tonight, as you sit beneath the quiet stars, remember that the Enlightenment was not a single event, but a constellation of minds daring to think freely. Remember that its victories were never guaranteed, and that each step forward was paid for with courage, sacrifice, and sometimes tragedy. And as you close your eyes on this final chapter, let one question linger. If reason once freed humanity from centuries of darkness, what might it free us from today, if we dare to let it shine? Thank you for joining us on this journey into the hidden shadows of history. If you found these untold stories as fascinating as we do, please like this video, share it with fellow truth seekers, and don't forget to subscribe to KTK History for more mysteries revealed every week. Leave a comment below. What secrets do you think still lie hidden in our past? We'll see you in the next investigation.